brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
Alrighty, we can start. And hopefully this is not going to be as insane as it was last time. This is our episode 27. Can you believe that we're already at 27? It's insanity if you ask me. And we are doing the ancient Greek still. And last time I was slightly out of it, so I don't remember what I said to everyone. Hopefully it wasn't anything terribly off kilter. But, you know, hope dies last. So, in this case, I would like to send out the shout not only to Marvine, which is what I usually do, but also to another wonderful Russian researcher. His last name is Strelkov, and he is a graduate and current employee of the MGU, Moscow State University. I just want to say thanks to him and to Marvine, and we are back to our lovely Greeks, and we're going to go over the stuff that most of us think that we know, but we really don't. And guys, if you like what we're doing, please go ahead and like the podcast. That helps us out a lot. It raises our ratings. And it just in general helps us to bump us up higher on the YouTube choices, which means more people will be able to see the podcast. And in addition, if you have any comments, you know, you're welcome to comment. I always try to reply to those. And I will post a link to a Facebook group. If you want to participate live, you're going to be able to contact me there and join us on our little Zoom meeting. Think that's all the announcements. Yes? I think so. All right. So, the ancient Greeks, we all know that the ancient Greece consisted of city-states. And these city-states are called polises. That's where we get our word metropolis from. That's where we get our word police from. Metropolis were metropoli. I don't know how you say that. Metropolises, polises. So metropolis, by the way, it just means the mother city. So when Athens, for example, started having colonies, all the colonies were just polises. And in relation to those colonies, Athens, for example, was the metropolis. That's all that means, is kind of the mothership of that colonization system. In Little Greece, which is not very large, we had over 1,000 different city-states. That's over 1,000. So you can imagine that the territories of these city-states were not particularly large. So every little square foot of land really mattered. Every citizen of each individual city-state was very much his citizenship. And yes, I mean his in this case, because even though the females later on were also accorded citizenship in their city-states, they nonetheless did not hold any voting or any real citizenship rights other than their children, by definition, would be also born citizens. But every man who owned his little plot of land, the moment that he would lose that plot of land, he would also lose his citizenship. So the land was really essential, and sometimes wars between city-states were fought over very small, you know, just ridiculously small areas of land, because that small area of land could be somebody's only source of their status, their citizenship, and their participation in the society of the polis. The polises in Greece never formed a single state. All Greeks knew that they were the same people. They all understood that they were part of the same ethnic, cultural, religious kind of population. But at the same time, they self-identified themselves by the polis of their residence. They never thought of themselves as Greeks. They thought of themselves as, I am an Athenian, I'm a Theban, I'm a Corinthian, and their patriotism, therefore, was also based on the city-state that they were born and were citizens of. And of course, exile for ancient Greeks was a horrible undertaking, because the exile meant that they went somewhere where they were still free peoples. They would not become slaves if they moved to a different city, but not only were they leaving their basic domestic gods behind, they were also leaving behind their ability to participate in the social life and in the political life, more importantly, in the religious life, led to a but they were leaving behind their ability to be active in the society. And in case people didn't know, the word idiot, the modern word idiot, just means somebody who does not participate in the political life of the city. So that should say something about how much these people valued their political involvement. All these city-states, they had various local dialects, but they were mutually legible. Greeks as a whole, as a ethnos, I guess, separated themselves from everyone else, whom they referred to as barbarians. And I'm sure everybody knows that one of the, claims is that it comes from the brr, 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 that foreign languages would sound like to somebody who spoke Greek. And that's a pretty common thing. A lot of nations refer to themselves as people and everybody else as something illegible. For example, in Russian language, the word for Germans is basically an equivalent to mutes. Just because the very first foreigners that came in large quantities into Russia were Germans and they did not speak Russian, so the locals just considered that they were not capable of normal human speech. Well, the same sort of concept was going on with Greeks, and it wasn't necessarily a derogatory term, it just meant that they are peoples other than ourselves. It was that juxtaposition that is going to continue on throughout the modern, even civilized world. It goes through the Greece, through the Greek civilization, through the Roman civilization, partially European civilization once it rises up from the kind of the collapse of the Dark Ages, and continues into modern day. And that is that idea that we are the light of knowledge, we're the center of the world, we are the civilized people, and everyone else out there on the outskirts, Persians, Scythians, Indians, anybody who's not us, them, they're all barbarians, and therefore they're beneath us. But originally that was not a derogatory term. The different regions, they did not develop at the same speed, they did not develop equally. Each one had a slightly different way in the way that it moved forward. We talked a little bit about Sparta in the last episode. Sparta was a very, very unique formation. I cannot even think of a single parallel in history in general of something that is even remotely as militant and as bizarrely organized as Sparta was. But Sparta maintained its king system for quite a long time comparing to other city-states, and it had a very unique form of rule. Though in a certain way, it also had Greeks. Well, it's not just Greeks. It seems like any sort of a city-state that forms seems to drift towards a voting system of one sort or another. If you think about the city of Republic of Novgorod, again in Russia, much later on, if you think about, various merchant republics that city-states kind of that formed, whether that's Guinness, whether that's Venetian, even if it's oligarchs ruling, it seems to me like there's some sort of a collegial rule, some sort of a group rule and voting system that seems to be involved with city-states as such. I'm not sure why that would be the case, but it just seems to be a fact. But today we're going to mostly talk about Athens, just because Athens is, Athenian democracy is what we are most familiar with as people of the West. That's what gave birth and gave rise to our democracy, or at least some of the concepts behind it, though our democracy has very little to do with what ancient Greeks were practicing. And there were the big five cities, that the big centers, because there were so many, there were thousands of them. To this day, the historians don't even know the names of all of them or locations of all of them, but there were the big five. Of course, that would be Athens, that would be Sparta, that would be Corinth, which was located in an outstanding geographical location, very fit for trade. Let me pull up a map real quick, actually. Okay, I just found it. Okay, Corinth is right here, and I'm going to go to the other map. Corinth is right here, and where it's located, it's actually located on the shore of the two seas, and so that makes it a kind of a prime location for trade. And I'm sorry, that's the only good map I could find. This is the Ionic Sea, this is the Aegean Sea right here, and this is right here is Athens, Thebes right here. Let's see which ones of the key ones. Of course, Sparta you have right here, and they have those Laconian lands. So our big five, once again, of course, we have Athens, we have Sparta, which is down here, and those are two of the eternal enemies. We have Thebes, which is located right here, and that's Boeotia. We have Corinth, which is a big one, and it's right here, that's Corinth. And then we have Argos. And Argos is another big center that was a center of trade also, and a major factor in the Greek history. But today we're going to talk mostly about Athens. So Athens, how did democracy, this wonderful political system that we have today, how did it come to be? Where did it come from? How was it formed? Well, originally, just like anywhere else, Athens was ruled by aristocracy. And aristocracy is a very unique term. And this was happening probably about 8th to 6th century BC. In the 8th century, the aristocracy and the demos, which is the other word for people. So there was aristocrats and the demos. That's where the word democratic comes from, in case somebody didn't know. What defines aristocracy? First of all, it is something that you cannot obtain, you cannot achieve. In later history, you see situations where people are granted nobility status for some sort of deeds. You could be knighted and become a noble for some sort of a battlefield deed. Well, at this stage in history, in ancient Greece, you were either born an aristocrat or you were not, and it was not anything you could change. But it was assumed that if you were born as aristocrat, you had certain traits. You also had certain duties and responsibilities. And every aristocratic family specifically traced themselves to a specific ancient hero. Because to the Greeks, the mythological time was actual real history. So you could walk out on the street and come across, a great-grandson of Hercules. Or you could come across one of the descendants of the gods. And that is why there was no social mobility between those two groups within each polis, and particularly specifically in Athens, because there was no way a commoner could cross that divide. If one of your long ancestors was not a god, then there's no way you would become an aristocrat, no matter how hard you worked or what you did. So, and since the gods don't come down much anymore, and don't mingle with people, I guess that's that for social mobility. So what was really important for the aristocrats? For them, there was a concept of ethos, and that is the idea, it's a quality of an aristocrat. It's, among other things, it's his physical beauty and perfection. Greeks had a cult of a perfect human body, of physical wholeness, beauty, soundness, and fitness. The other important aspect of an aristocrat was agathos. It's the internal perfection, it's the warrior spirit, the aritar, the nobility of a person. Another thing that aristocrats were expected to be was to be wealthy. And that's just something that came with the territory. There was no such thing early on as a, bankrupt aristocrat. If you were an aristocrat, you likely had a plot of land. And if you had a plot of land, you had slaves working on it. You had source of income that way. Plus, you were a warrior. By definition, aristocrats always were warriors. And so you went to war and you brought in spoils of war into your household. But with that came another very important duty, just like in a lot of early societies, whose aristocracy rose up from the original tribal elites, warrior elites of the tribes. Those warrior elites, just like in Vikings later on, were expected to share their good fortune with the people. So one of the very important qualities of the aristocrat was not only to be rich, but to also be very generous. The idea that wealth was not to be something that wasn't to be hoarded, it was something that was to be distributed continuously. So the idea was that you continuously, it's almost like the biological concept of costly signaling. The idea that a peacock's long tail, for example, makes it harder for a peacock to fly away from a predator. And therefore, if a male is able to have that wonderful adornment and still survive, that proves that he's beyond physical fitness to just survive. Almost the same thing worked with aristocrats. In other words, they had to continuously prove that they were able to maintain and accumulate wealth while constantly handing it out. It was common for, just like today in modern Caucasus, some of the other Eastern societies, it's common if you come to a person's house and they notice that you're looking at, at a statue they have on on a shelf, or you're looking at a picture or something else, a teapot, they'll just give it to you, because the idea is to pass on the gifts, pass on the good fortune, kind of pass on a bit of your good luck, of your fortune to everybody around you. So that was, the generosity was, they had to live very extravagant lifestyles, not in the sense that they were vainly spending, but in the sense that it was constant validation of their status, of their divine destination, predestination, I guess. And also the decor of an aristocrat's house was extremely important. It was important for them to have a lot of trinkets, a lot of items, a lot of expensive adornments in their house, because again, that proved their status. Another factor, an aristocrat's burial, one of the archaic aristocrat burials, would have been very rich in various offerings, in various gold and other precious metals, goods, weapons. The thing is that Greeks did not believe in an afterlife in the same way that other peoples believed in an afterlife. I mean, they believed in an afterlife where you became a shade, in the kingdom of Hades and wandered there aimlessly. And really, that rich person who was, that wealthy aristocratic person who was being buried, realistically had no use of those items. They did not have a cult where they thought that the warrior was going to continue using his sword on the other side. No, it wasn't about that. It was more about that continuous destruction of wealth, to show that you're wealthy, to show the status of the buried person. So it was more for the living than the dead in case of the ancient Greek, surprisingly. Another thing that was very much expected of any aristocrat was knowledge/education levels. They were expected to be well educated in poetry, in art, in various literature that existed at that time, philosophy, and they were expected to spend their free time that they acquired partially through the use of the labor of other people, partially through their status. They were expected to not only defend the territory that they were the aristocrats of, but they were also expected to be kind of those beams of light, of knowledge, of enlightenment almost. And that's something that gets picked up later on in history. Aristocracy in general throughout what European Western history is expected to be very well educated, though they didn't always live up to it. But these guys all of them were literate. All of them could, do sciences in the sense that ancient Greeks could be said to have sciences. They all could, dance. They all could. Another thing that they invented was sports. And that is a kind of very few places in human history has sports been invented as a concept of a pastime where it's ritualized warfare that is not a duel and is not an actual kind of battle competition. It's simulation of a battle competition. But in ancient Greece, sports, they did not have this idea that somebody got the first place in the Olympics, somebody got the second place, somebody got the third. You either won or you lost. There was just one winner for each competition and everyone else was a loser. And that was the idea that you had to show your fitness, your goodness. Another thing that was very, very important was that each and every one of these aristocrats was supposed to be a bright, outstanding, and unhindered individuality. Each one of them wanted to stand out. Each one of them wanted to be unique, not in the sense that we often see in the modern culture where it's me, I'm special snowflake. No, they wanted to leave a mark in history. The idea was that you did not let down the honor of your lineage, that you did not do any deeds, did not take any action that would in any way harm or in any way shade the memory of your ancestors. No, but instead you took the glory of your ancestors. You took what your ancestors have done, the great deeds of your ancestors, and you built upon them to try to further improve the reputation. The reputation of the aristocrats was absolutely everything to them. It was very important. It was a part of the nobility concept, just like it will be in later Europe. And the whole concept of honor pretty much gets originated there. Whatever you do, do not dishonor your lineage. Do not dishonor the memory of your ancestors. That is absolutely unacceptable. Now, what is demos? Demos from that democracy word, the peoples, basically the commoners. Well, demos basically means low, poor, low class. And it was due to Moira, or in other words, fate. It wasn't their fault that they were that way. You couldn't expect anything else from the commoners. They were just born that way. That was their fate. That was not their fault, just like an aristocrat was born as a descendant of one of the heroes or gods, which is the same thing, really. Because heroes are really a mix between a god and some sort of other being, usually a human. But the commoners were born to be low class. They were born to be poor. They were born to toil on their land. They could not be expected to rise up above it. They were not expected to have an education. They were not expected to have honor. There's nothing you could do about it. I mean, you have no wealth, no chance for, social lift, and you have really no future, no change to your fate in sight. And it was a very stable system because it's a very stable worldview, because if it's something that you accept and you just accept that that's just your lot and there's nothing you can do about it, it's something that you pretty much just deal with and move on with your daily deeds however you can. I'm going to stop for a second, see if anybody has anything to say.
I actually was going to jump in and say that from what you describe, it seems like they almost had a little bit of an altruistic mentality in some ways. And I was also going to mention, now I had to look at the map with my reading glasses, but really the spelling of those areas, boy, my Russian is terrible, but it really is phonetical almost. I mean, it's close. I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, it is. And, and you're absolutely right. Every time the concept of nobility, well, aristocracy would be the more accurate term, arises in any human culture, it carries with it that altruistic factor. The idea is that the aristocrats, they are the first line of defense, so they exist to protect the people, and the people, for the peasants to be able to work, the nobility has to be the first line of defense. And the peasants know they will be the first one to go, to war if somebody invades. They will be the first ones to die. And it's kind of a social contract to where the peasants or the commoners work for the nobility, and the nobility enjoys the fruits of that labor, but when the problem comes, when there's a conflict, they absolutely throw themselves at it and do not in any way preserve their lives in order to protect the commoners. And also with that kind of comes the idea that because a noble person or an aristocrat is by virtue of his or her birth is select and special, they expected to behave up to a certain standard. They cannot behave in the same way that a commoner would. They could not lie, they could not steal, they could not be lowly, they could not be dishonorable. And another thing that comes with that concept that's important that I forgot to say is that because the commoners, this demos, was lowly born and by default uneducated, they could not be expected, in the opinion of the society of that time. They could not be expected and they could not be trusted to govern in any way, shape, or form. They just simply do not have the cognitive skills or the education base to do that. And therefore, that is something that the aristocracy does always.
Basically, they weren't enough like gods or goddesses in a way.
It was more like a relationship between parents and children, really, to where the aristocrats are responsible for, they protect, they sacrifice for, they provide for the people, while the people are unruly, kind of immature, and cannot be trusted to make decisions for themselves. I mean, that was what was believed at the time. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying that was the belief system that took place. And both classes believed it. Wasn't just the aristocrats who believed that was the commoners too. I mean, for example, even 50, 20 years prior to the revolution in the Russian Empire, you had the peasants who did not want to be educated, who thought it was up to the lords, to the aristocracy, to the nobility to make the decisions, because our job is to provide for you, your job is to defend us and to make those decisions. It was a social contract from both sides.
It's kind of like a voluntary social stratification in a way, almost.
Right. And if this is a topic, that interests anyone, if you look at medieval warfare, for example, let's just as a way of understand this better. Let's say we're a small country and we're trying to send a mounted knight into battlefield so he can protect our lands. Well, a mounted knight is an expensive machine. The horse, the good war horse, costs a lot of money. Just the armor itself costs absolutely ridiculous amount of money. The sword, the shield, all the equipment that any person would be required to wear in order to be able to be an effective warrior is very expensive. And let's say we have a village of 25 households, not a single one of those households by themselves is going to be able to afford even a fraction of that equipment. But if those 25 households get together and they choose among them, let's say the most warlike man, and we're going to kind of pitch in together, we're going to work on our land so we can buy you this equipment so you are capable of representing us in war. It's a very similar sort of thing. I mean, I'm using a medieval example, but it's very easy. That's how it's a social contract. And so it was almost seen like as a self-sacrifice. It's like volunteering to go to war. So it was seen almost as a selfless action. And so, yes, they would provide for this person. And then, over time that got set into a habitual thing to where the lineage of that person now, everybody was looking at them saying, oh, that family are the ones who take care of the war stuff. We can stay home, we can feed them and just not worry about it. The problem that with aristocracy that oftentimes happens is when they stop performing that function, when there's because even though that contract gets forgotten over time and the peasants no longer remember that it was actually a verbal contract that was made, but there's still that sense. And once the nobility stops performing their duties, once they stop risking their life and, doing everything they can for the best of the people, that's usually when you start getting uprisings, because even kind of subliminally, subconsciously, the peasants understand that the contract has been breached. And now they basically have a parasite instead of somebody who's performing a function. But yeah, that's kind of the concept behind that.
If a farmer needed something, very often they would turn to aristocrats to provide it for them, and get the backing of and give their backing to that aristocrat.
And this very thing, this very social contract is what kind of did the aristocrats at least in Athens. Because with colonization, as we talked about last time, the economic growth started happening, but this economic growth mostly affected the commoners. And the reason why it affected the commoners and disadvantaged the aristocracy is because aristocrats, one, had to be generous, so they all constantly had to be giving out. But they couldn't be merchants. It was against their honor code. They couldn't be mercantile. They had to be noble. They had to not involve themselves in trade. They had to only accumulate wealth through warfare. Commoners just simply started making crazy money on just trade. I mean, as we see that happening today, somebody comes up with a neat product, everybody wants to buy it, you suddenly make a fortune. And suddenly the commoners started rising up to the level of aristocrats and wealth. And the moment they started rising up to the level of aristocrats and wealth, they started wanting to have the same access to the same, facilities almost as the aristocrats did. Primarily, it would be education. And so while the commoners started rising, sometimes the aristocrats, due to their generosity and to that kind of almost altruistic behavior, started going bankrupt. And so you have a situation that is very similar to the situation that happened again in Europe, when you have the middle class rising, because the merchant class, because the merchants are ridiculously wealthy, but they don't have any nobility to them, while the aristocrats are ridiculously poor. And some of the aristocrats started breaking the ranks, because originally the aristocratic kind of layer of the society was very separate from the commoners. You did not intermarry with locals. Commoners, if you couldn't find a wife or husband within your own community, you would look into other policies. And if you couldn't find ones in there, you will find, a chieftain's daughter from a barbarian tribe, but you would not marry a commoner. That was almost like, it was just not done. You did not mix like that. But once this kind of the rise in wealth, this kind of economic boom started happening, and this is, happening around plus or minus 7th BC. Some aristocratic families in desperation started turning to the wealthy merchant families. They started intermarrying, so bringing the wealth in together with the name. And the majority of the aristocratic society was not very comfortable with that situation. They did not like anybody who would break ranks and marry a commoner was looked down upon. So other aristocrats tried to prove their worth, their aristocracy, their bright, outstanding, unhindered individuality by trying to seize power altogether. But they tried to seize power not relying on other aristocratic families. So some would break ranks and go down, towards the commoners. The other ones would try to break ranks and go up. And that's where our idea of tyrants comes from. Now, the tyrants, they are the people who saw the force, the power in the demos and the common people, and they would ally with the common people and try to be unique and individual, outstanding in their own way by seizing power from all the other aristocrats and becoming the tyrants of the city. And so you have this kind of you see that same again collision much later, for example, in France, when you have absolute monarchy. It's that idea that an absolute monarch or an absolute ruler, in this case it's a tyrant, usually lines up with the kind of generic masses and not with the aristocrats, because when you have aristocrats, you have this idea when it's best among equal, where you have other people, lords and everything else you have to compete with. But if you are a tyrant, which is where that word originates from, a singular ruler, or if you're an absolute monarch, you don't want all these other aristocrats around. You want just to rule by yourself, there being an absolute void between you at the top and all the other people at the bottom, without that layer of aristocrats getting in your way, who can possibly tell you what to do, interfere with your policies, because they're also of similar birth to yours, but they're not your relatives, they're not your descendants, they are from other lineages that are just as noble as yours is, and could potentially pose a threat. The main opposition of tyrants throughout history always is aristocracy, and aristocracy will always fight to the bitter end. And this repeats in history over and over. This is the first time, at least, we see it clearly happening, just because we have so many records. And of course, they will fight until their very feeding base, their very power base is taken away, until their land is confiscated and it is distributed to the people. Now, taking away their land, so the tyrants took away the land, the properties of the aristocrats, which basically, because aristocrats could also be independent, right? They had lands to be able to feed from. So even if they weren't dependent on their tyrant to provide them food, they didn't have to obey any rules. They could just close off. Again, in Middle Ages, we'll see that they could just close off on their own estate. And because, well, we have our own food sources, we can produce everything we need. Forget you, I'm an independent unit. Well, in order to prevent that, that's why their lands were taken away. And once they lost their lands, they pretty much, once they were sent off into exile, aristocratic or not, they became pretty much powerless and useless. And so the cities started being ruled by tyrants who have destroyed their opponents. Again, they handed out land, not because they were nice, progressive people who thought the peasants should have land. They did it not to improve the life of the peasants. They did it to bring down their opponents, which would have been the aristocrats. But a lot of these early tyrants were very, like I said last time, were very skilled at what they were doing. They were good rulers. Because they were because especially in first generation, you just came to power and you know that you see this kind of wobbly underneath you, right? So you want to keep the people on your good side. You want to keep yourself on the good side of the people. You want to stick with your promises. You want to make useful reforms. And usually it's the people who came to power by those means were people with, I've talked about the concept of passionarism last time, that kind of drive, that kind of people who were already kind of standout people with some sort of ambitions or some sort of ideas, some sort of, outstanding qualities. And so the early tyrants throughout all the different city-states oftentimes were very productive. They were very helpful. And of course, when you have helpful to the progress of the society, they made a lot of innovations, a lot of reforms. And when you have a singular source of power, the decisions are made just like that. All it takes is for one person to make that decision, right? So the cities started experiencing their peak of art, of prosperity during the time of the early tyrants. But with the rising level of life in general, so with the prosperity of the generic population, the population's expectations and their requirements started rising as well. And soon they got to, their education levels went up, their, level of life, of their state of wealth, various social programs and so on. They started feeling not as downtrodden peasants, like half animals, they started feeling as actual people. And once they started being educated and feeling, some self-respect, some dignity, they got to the point of where they looked at each other and said, well, what do we need these tyrants for? What do we need these tyrants for? Before they doubted that they were capable of self-organization, self-ruling, but because they believed that aristocrats had this God's-given ability to do so. But suddenly the aristocrats are gone. Now we have just one aristocrat, and that's the tyrant. And wait a minute, we're doing all the other work around here anyway, so why don't we just rule ourselves, right? And especially considering that the tyrants, oftentimes their children or grandchildren, because the tyrant themselves usually went through some hardships before they came to power. It's often the case with bastard children in medieval history. Again, bastard princes, when the first generation of a dynasty goes through hardship to come to power, and therefore the ruler that you get and resolve is first of all reasonable because he understands what hardships it took to get to the point of power. He is also very motivated to keep that power, to stay in the good graces of the people. But his children or grandchildren especially oftentimes are raised in wealth. They're spoiled brats, and oftentimes you have brilliant first generation tyrants or kings, and then their offspring are just absolutely not fit to rule. And that's what happened. Most of these dynasties did not last past the third generation at all. People just got rid of them because the consequent rulers became less and less fit to be any sort of at any sort of helm of any ship, metaphorically speaking. And so 2-3 generations, the tyrants went away. And after the downfall of the tyrants, the aristocracy was no longer needed either, because they were just, their function was no longer needed. People themselves the demos itself could perform the function of the aristocrats. So aristocrats were never called back oftentimes. Overall, as a general historical tendency, the aristocracy just pretty much kind of fizzled out. And because it remained in name only, like I am from a noble lineage and I'm proud of it, but I still function just like an average citizen and don't have any special preferential rights. So most policies, one way or another, they became republics. And these republics were either democracies where the people ruled, or there were oligarchies where the select few, the same meaning as the word has today, where the select few, the rich clans rule. And so by about the end of 6th century BC, that's when pretty much the age of tyrants was gone, and with the age of democracies and oligarchies started kind of predominant form of rule in the entire Greek world. And Aristotle in 4th BC, he speaks about 6 forms of governing, and he has 3 good forms and 3 bad forms, and they come in pairs. So a good form of governing that he talks about is the monarch is the good form of this, because a king is a legitimate ruler. They were bred into it, and they're going to be responsible, to where the tyrant who sees the power irresponsibly is more likely going to abuse it. Now, the next good form of rule that, and again, this is Aristotle talking about in a very kind of theoretical term, would be aristocracy. And that means because they're, nobility, they're all noble. It's the rule of the minimum of the small group over the larger population. But again, it's a select group with proper responsibilities, proper upbringing, training, mentality. The thing that Aristotle considered to be a bad version of that is the oligarchy, because in this case you have the same thing as with a tyrant. You have an elite, but it's not a naturally born elite. It's not genetic elite, I guess. It's an elite that rose up through the ranks, and so it's kind of new wealth, and so they cannot be trusted to be responsible as the peoples. And the last form that he considered to be good was democracy. And the democracy is the idea where the majority, not just the majority, in Aristotle's idea, democracy was when majority middle class peoples rule. So he would have preferred a democracy where the dominant decision makers would not be the upper layers of the society, because the way that Aristotle saw it, that upper, wealth end of the society within a democracy would always be suspicious of the middle class coming up on their heels, and, therefore very inclined to preserve their wealth, and they're somewhat aggressive towards anybody else who is succeeding, and not the lowest levels of the society, because to him those are more or less losers, right? And what he wanted to see is a majority rule of the middle class people, because to him middle class people who made an average amount of money, who worked hard, who were responsible, who have achieved enough comforts in their life to not be desperate, and yet not so much to have to hoard it, that they were the most trustworthy people. And the bad pair to that was achlocratia. And achlocratia is the rule of the poor. That's when the crowd basically takes over, and the most poor, the kind of the bums, the various just dregs of the society come to power, and he did not consider that to be a very good form of governing. So that's Aristotle's thoughts on the forms of rule. I'm going to stop, see if anybody has any input.
I'm sure as they transformed into democracies, there were still leading families, and there would have been a certain competition both for the commoner to rise and for the aristocrat to maintain. And I'm sure, like I said earlier, that peasants or former peasants who were now freedmen, basically, that could now provide their own arms and armor, are enough to function within the phalanx anyway. I'm pretty sure that those relationships were really complex between the well-to-do, the ambitious, and the noble families trying to maintain themselves. But that's about all I can say.
It seems like a lot of their ideas really do trickle down into our modern Western society. I mean, we just keep recycling them, and so it popped into my head.
And I do have to say, I kind of agree with Aristotle that oligarchies are really rough things to live, considering we live in more of an oligarchy than we do a democracy, I would say. in my humble
Save that
opinion.
for another conversation, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, fabulous pictures.
Okay, so anybody else had any comments on that? Sorry, we kind of got sidetracked there for a minute.
Just two comments. One, fantastic pictures. Where were those from?
That's from Athens, actually. That's my trip, I think 2015, and I'm going to show some in a minute. But yeah.
And also, I really appreciate that you're talking about, and you're willing to talk about the psychology of people, of thinking, of where people are coming from, because in so many histories and so many historians, they're so unwilling to talk about the psychology of people and what they're actually thinking, what's going through their heads.
Well, thank you, Nathan. By the way, it's good to see you. Yeah, those are some of the pictures from my trip to Athens in 2015, and I will show some more here in a minute. And I'm sorry for the background noise. We have janitors vacuuming right here. Can you? 1 second, sorry. Yeah, like I said, today is my day of technical difficulties.
Here, I'll throw another thing in there. By the way, thank you also for mentioning psychology, Nathan, because I think that that's really what we need to look at with ancient Greece often, is how in our modern society, a lot of their psychology, it just really seems to affect us. We basically have recycled it over and over and over, and we need to figure out, where did that come from? So I'm glad that we can hit that topic today.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to step away from politics for a second and just talk about how the society was organized a little bit. So every Greek person, and when I say Greek person, I by default mean males, because females was kind of a whole separate subject. But every Greek male went to school. You went through the first couple years of school, you got your basic education. Now, school in Greece, polenta, and then gymnasium, it was half and half. Half of your time was, spent in mental, pursuits, various intellectual pursuits. Half of your time was spent on forming your physical form, exercises, and absolutely required art of dancing. Early on, basically what you guys would call, elementary school was standard, was more or less affordable for any citizen of any Greek state. After that, the parents could decide whether they wanted to pay a little bit more money and continue educating their child, or they wanted to pull their child out. And just, for example, if it's somebody who worked on the land and didn't really need any sort of advanced knowledge of any writing or literature or anything like that, or arts, they could have just every citizen had a basic education, like the first several classes, but after that was up to the family how far they went in the educational process. So then there were two more stages. So polenta ended, and then there was the gymnasium. But then throughout the education process, every male child got introduced to both the physical and the intellectual part of education. The father had to bring the child, regardless of whether it was a male or female, before a local council. Basically, they would periodically hold kind of a neighborhood get together of kind of like an HOA meeting, except it was more governing thing, where neighbors would get together and the father would bring a child before them and say, "This is my daughter. I want to acknowledge this person as my legitimate daughter, born of a legitimate, lawful wife, not a child of a slave or concubine, not a legitimate child, and I want to recognize this child." And that's how you, as a citizen, how you became a citizen of a city-state, by your father introducing you to these other men and if you had good relations with your neighbors, they would say, "Oh, yeah, we know him. He's been running around since he was yay big," or "She's been running around. Yeah, we know, great son, great daughter." And they would put them on a list. The cities kept a list of people. So that was kind of your passport. In order to get your voting rights, in order to go through all your other required stages of life, you had to be recognized as an official citizen. If you had bad relationship with your neighbors, they go, "No, we don't think so. We think the kid is a child of a slave. We're not going to recognize them." And then you had a whole bunch of problems. But once the child got recognized at the age of 18, every Athenian got drafted into military service. And this was not something that was dreaded. This was not something that was avoided. This was something that every male citizen of Athens was absolutely striving to do. It was an important duty for each and every one of them. Now, there was not a lot of boot camp required, because these boys were, again, there was this cult of physical health and, of perfection. these boys were in prime state. They were already well exercised. You didn't have a case when, you have a recruit who's kind of hanging down and not able to do any push-ups. These guys were in prime shape. So for the first year, these recruits, they would spend first year training, right? How to handle arms, how to fight in formation, just the basic military skills. The second year in Athens, they would serve basically as border patrol. They would be the ones defending the border, and they would serve for 1 year. So 1 year training, 1 year service. It was absolutely mandatory for every male citizen. Every male citizen did this by default. And it was a 2-year draft. Now, these boys, this youth, and you went in by the year of your birth. So because when you got introduced by your father, your age also got recorded. So they knew roughly when you turn 18, and that's when you would get drafted. So it would be year of let's say they did like 624 BC, all the boys that were born this year. So for example, there was an instance where Sparta attacked Athens. The boys held off the onslaught, and that whole generation, they all died. And Patroclus, in his famous speech, he had compared that boys were being buried. He had compared that event to early frost on a field where all the crops, and their bloom just get nipped and taken away. It was a very tragic event for the city. So once you were done with the draft, you came back, and at 20 years old, you now became actually a citizen, an official citizen. You could now participate in the political life. You could vote, you could participate in gatherings, but you could not run for office. You were not fit to run for office until you turned 30 years old. That's when Greeks believed the man's basically hormones. I mean, they didn't think of it. They consider it to be the most balanced time in the man's life. It's starting at 30 is when a man is able to think clearly and is no longer boyish and kind of, driven by his urges. And so at 30, you could run for office. You pretty much were required to run for office. Everybody had to serve in one or another official capacity during their lifetime. The age of 50 was considered to be the prime of a man's life. And at the age of 50, the man was considered to be wise and still physically capable, have enough experience, both physically and emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, to be in his prime state. Now, for the girls, it was slightly different. For the girls, usually got married much earlier. For example, it was considered that the prime age to get married for a man was around 30, and the prime age for a bride was around 15, because around 15 he could still shape her to his preferences and liking, and it was considered to be a good age difference. 15-year-old girl, 30-year-old man was standard. I mean, usually girls got married around the age of 20. Greeks were kind of unique in that way. Their ages of maturity were much later than a lot of ancient societies. Acme is the word acme. Is the word for the heights of the man states, the state of balance, the state of perfection of, inner prime. The thing was about Greeks is they did not like cripples. Now, with the exception of war veterans. Now, war veterans were considered to be honorable men who have given, their health for the defense of their home city, and they were given a pension and they were treated with respect. But if you were born crippled, or if you were just a loser, Greeks would not give a penny to somebody begging on the street, because the way they looked at a cripple is somebody who's punished by gods, or a diseased person. They would see physical imperfection as a curse from the gods, and only a stupid person would try to go against the will of the gods. So to give a coin, or to give, a loaf of bread or whatever to a cripple, Greeks they did not like beggars, they did not like cripples, they did not have much of a culture of compassion in that sense. They figured that if you were that way, there was a reason for that, and get away from me. Basically, that was the idea. Any comments before we jump on more into the political stuff?
I didn't know about the cripple part. That's kind of news to me, actually. I always assumed that the Greeks were mostly compassionate when it came to the disabled. So that's kind of interesting. So if you were a war veteran or whatever, you were held in high regard. But if you were not recognized as like a veteran or something, you were held in very low regard.
Yeah, especially birth defects. So, I mean, if it was an injury, a person was crippled due to an injury, it really depended on the circumstances of the injury. But oftentimes, if it was just somebody walking down, fell, broke their leg, didn't grow up together right, they considered that to be a straight curse from the gods. But somebody who was born that way, they consider that the gods have cursed either them or their parents right at the beginning, and that's that.
So getting back to Ryan's comment earlier and question about carrying the psychology forward. So at the end of your presentation, I'll have a comment to make on that.
Okay, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's move on to the topic that is dear and near at heart to all of us in this world today, and that's the topic of democracy. Now, when I listen, because I really like the topic of ancient Greece, it's a topic that we have a lot of sources on, and it's endlessly fascinating to me. So every specialist in ancient Greece starts shaking violently the moment they hear the word democracy on the news, from some politician's mouth, when applied to any modern state, because democracy existed at one time and in one place only. And democracy was only possible as a political system due to very specific social, well, first of all, geographic, second of all, population, social, et cetera, circumstances. They started in Athens, they started to build democracy in 594 BC, and it finally came to its fruition and became some sort of a settled, established, and easily recognizable system almost 50 years later. And it lasted about 150 years. So it took not one generation, not two generations, multiple generations to establish any sort of stable system that was even remotely approaching developed democracy. The other thing, the reason why those kind of unique, and this is something that is unique to Greece. Here's the thing, any map of Greece we're going to look at is not going to have all the city-states, right? Because there's just, when we're looking at the southern of them, so this just has the larger ones. This just has the spheres of influence here. Let me pull it up. I mean, if you look, Greece is not that big. And I mean, this is minimal amount, and this is not even all the city-states that were present there, but like even on this map, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Now, if you think about Greece, it's an extremely rocky, not very fertile terrain, with a lot of kind of uneven places which are not good for plowing. They're not good for any sort of agriculture. It's not very rich. It's not very plentiful land to begin with. Second of all, it was very heavily populated. And every little scrap of land people fought for. Every little scrap of land meant somebody's citizenship, like I was saying in the beginning. And so people in these societies and within these policies, each one of them was absolutely responsible for protecting. First of all, every citizen knew that his status as a citizen, his privileged status really, his freedom to be a part of society, to make decisions, his dignity really depended on defending the land. So each and every able-bodied citizen, and even non-citizens, sometimes even slaves, volunteered to fight to defend the land. It was absolutely essential. Every one of those men was absolutely responsible. Second of all, every one of the men who were part of this democracy, and the main thing, these were kind of smaller territories. So basically in a democratic society, even the largest one, most people at least knew each other by having common friends. They almost knew each other by sight. Like you would know when a stranger would enter a polis because you would just be able to tell you more or less seen these faces throughout your lifetime. So they were very small societies with a limited number of people. And each person could individually, personally participate in the decision making. They all invested in the betterment of the society because they all were directly affected by the betterment of the society. By the same token, none of them were in any sort of dependent status, because just like it was aristocrats, later on in democratic states, the commoners, these new commoners, the citizens, they all had little plots of land, and even if it was a tiny itty-bitty plot of land, it was still enough to feed the man and his family. And so he could not be bribed, he could not be blackmailed into, because if you didn't own land, you were not a citizen by default. I mean, you had to be a landowner to be a citizen. You had to be a responsible, married landowner. So you have to be proven the fact that you're capable of managing your own household, you're capable of taking care of your land, that you have already gone through the military service, so you're a capable warrior. And each individual was personally invested in the betterment of their state, the success of their state, because if that state failed for whatever reason, that person's family would by default be stripped of their status, and they would just become exiles in some other city-state. So it was a very personal, under very unique conditions of extreme populational, geographical, economic pressure, these unique societies were able to form and maintain themselves in such a form because of those limited resources, because of the personal investment of each individual, because of the scarceness of land. None of these conditions are met whatsoever in modern society. And so every time I hear a history professor, somebody who's a specialist in ancient Greece, talk about the word democracy in the modern world, they just kind of tear their hair out and more or less cry at it. But people could not be forced to live in democracy. Democracy is not something that you can force upon a society. Democracy is something that the people themselves, it's a quality, it's a state of mind, it's a mental, it's a mentality, really. It's a mentality of a whole society born by certain circumstances. So what we live in today, what we call democracy, is not really democracy per se, in the sense that ancient Greeks used that word. It's a whole new political invention, though we now use the same term, democracy, for it. And I think I'm going to stop there, and I'm just going to really quickly stop sharing. Wait, let me stop sharing this. How do I do that? And just show you a couple of pictures. Nathan, if you want to talk while I'm showing the other photos, you're more than welcome to. I'm just going to go through some of the photos from my trip to Athens. Anybody? That's me photographing stairs. I was running around with a camera and photographing absolutely everything in sight. So some of these are kind of strange pictures, but you get a pretty good idea of what, that's me. Gosh, I just lost the word for it. What's the word for this, guys? Pantheon looks like today. This is pretty modern. Go ahead, somebody.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. No, so just this is an anecdotal story to share. And when I worked back east in New Jersey, getting started in my trade, this is 20 years ago, and worked with a wonderful gentleman, Joseph Solvenhazy, who was in his mid-80s, and he was Hungarian. And he told me a story, and I was trying to figure out a solution to a problem. And he told me this, if you will, a wonderful, delightful anecdotal story, more of a, I forget the term, but anyways, it was about this young girl who was sent to the butcher to get a ham hock, to cook for dinner. And the butcher asked her, do you want the hock on the ham or off? And she's like, well, I don't know. And the butcher said, well, your family usually gets it with the hock off. So she takes it home and she asks her mother. She says, Mother, why do we always get the ham with the hock off? And her mother says, well, I don't know. We always get it that way. And so her mother asked her mother, the girl's grandmother, says, Mother, why do we always get the ham with the hock off? Mother says, I really don't know. I never really thought about that. Let me ask grandmother. So she asked grandmother. Grandmother says, well, when asked the question, she says, well, we get the hock off because that was the only way it could fit into the pot. And so oftentimes, our thinking on things is shaped by the pot we're trying to put it into.
Yep, perfect. That's the perfect explanation and perfect way of looking at it. Oftentimes our behavior is shaped by circumstances, traditions that are based on circumstances that we're no longer aware of in any way, shape, or form, but we still carry that with us, that pattern of behavior, absolutely. Does anybody else have any input on this stuff?
I was just going to mention that, like, when it comes to democracy, today people forget where democracy comes from. Like, obviously we know it comes from the ancient Greeks, more or less, at least that's the only explanation that I can figure out. But we forget where it actually comes from in the sense that, well, I didn't even really realize that, okay, democracy really actually did come from somebody of having a political voice because they were basically privileged, or they worked their ass off, and pardon my French,
that's fine,
worked their butt off, and they got into actually owning something, and then they had a vote. And we kind of forget that sometimes, and we change the word around and so on and so forth. But hey, good to look backwards and figure out where it comes from, I guess.
Absolutely.
And and with that, Ryan, you look back at the framing of the Constitution, and there was such a heavy prevalence by the framers of the Constitution on property ownership. And that was very much heavily influenced by this classical world.
Absolutely. and lack of women. One thing I did mention, that women had only one right in the polis. They had the right to be citizens, and that only was valuable in the sense that you could birth children. Like if a citizen woman, was had a child, legitimate marriage child, was even illegitimate, actually was a non-citizen. I mean, the child still would inherit. Pericles passed that reform, would still inherit the citizenship from his mother. But that's the only way you could really be a citizen, is by inheriting it. You could, I mean, very rarely. I think some people were made honored citizens, but I can't think of a case like that. That may not even be the case in ancient Greece. But I think, no, there was one person who was, I can't remember his name. He was a slave who was such a good philosopher. He was a black slave, actually, and right about Aristotle's time, who was given honorary citizenship. But I know of only one case like that. The guy was really good at telling really vulgar and thought-provoking parables, if I remember correctly. I'll look up his name. But women, other than that, I mean, we will talk about the Geteras and kind of the role of women in Greek society, which is to say there was no role of women in Greek society. You got married, you got locked in what was called the gynecium, which was the female part of the house, and you maybe sometimes visited with your neighbors. The women didn't go to the market. The women didn't come out of the house at all. They pretty much stayed indoors all the time within the space of gynecium, and that's that. They didn't even go to the male part of the house. So, yeah, not much children, let alone any voting rights. No, none of that. I forget which one of the great philosophers said that the reason why women are not included in our democracy is because by nature they're too weak and feeble and not capable of decision making. So, well, keep them locked up like that, and I'm sure they will be, right from the age of 15. Ryan, you're muted.
Oh, I was muting, but I unmuted and then I muted because I didn't want to interrupt you, but that reminded me of an old saying that I heard, and it's from Switzerland, and I wonder if Switzerland is actually very influenced also by Greek ideals. But there's an old Swiss saying that only an armed man can have political rights.
Right. There's a Russian saying that says, kind word does a lot, but a kind word in a Glock does a lot more.
That's Al Capone right there.
Yeah. Okay, guys, does anybody else? Yeah, go ahead, Nathan.
Just very briefly there, Ryan, speaking of the Swiss Constitution is a wonderful manuscript to read over. And in the Swiss Constitution, it is required of citizenship. If you are a citizen of Switzerland, you have to understand and know the Constitution. It is mandatory. And
right.
Just because you live in Switzerland doesn't mean you're a citizen. It's really interesting. You have to pass an exam.
It's very, very strict from my understanding. And I'm wondering if maybe they're taking a little bit of that from ancient Greece, actually, because the Greek influence is just, I don't know, I swear, we're just bent on it when it comes to Western society, so to speak.
Well, and the thing is not just Western society. You'd be surprised, but the early portrayals of Buddha, for example, the very first portraits of Buddha in India, of all places, are actually more or less portraits of Apollo. For example, the influence that the Greek culture had on the world as such, all of the world, not just the Western world, is absolutely immense. Where they didn't spread themselves physically, they kind of seeded and spread their culture. I mean, the Greek influence is heavy, and Eastern societies. Bactria, modern day Afghanistan, was kind of a Greek territory. Like I said, they went as far as India and China was their influences. So, they were such a unique society, and so. Not to mention Middle East, of course, with Alexander's conquest, and not to mention Rome, which took a lot straight from Greece. Not to mention Middle Ages, which was insane about Greece. 19th century was absolutely obsessed with Greece. I mean, Renaissance, all of that stuff. I mean, it's such a unique concept, and I mean, I'm not sure how unique it is, but I'm sure that I don't know if it may have arisen in other times or not. I don't know of any other society that was to that degree. That productive, that effective, and that kind of brightly outstanding, produced so much art, produced so much thought, philosophy, and everything all at once, and managed to not only produce it, but deliver it to the future generations. And that's another reason why I think the Greeks stand out, is because just the body, the volume of works that they left behind them is just immense comparing to a lot of other cultures, like the Hittites, which we have very little about, for example. But yeah, I mean, the Greeks left their big shining trace in history of the humankind for sure. All right, guys, unless somebody else has something to say, I just wanted to set the next date. We are looking at the 17th. Does that work for everyone? Same place, same time. We'll be doing Greeks for a while, so just put on your don't put on your Greek hats. Actually, they did have hats. They had straw hats because in the sun in Greece, you'd have to protect your head. So put on your olive oil and your straw hats and your sandals. Piers?
Hey, just a real quick random question, but should I put on my olive oil and scrape it off with one of those scrapers? I hear they use those.
They did. We can talk about the hygiene of the well, we'll talk about daily life and hygiene. Chris, what were you saying?
Toga party.
Yeah.
No, wait till we get to Rome and we'll do a toga party. I promise. Well, thank you, everyone, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Ryan, I will give you a call back. I'm sorry I haven't yet. It's been a crazy couple of days.
Don't apologize. If it was important, I would have called you 5 times and left a message. No worries. You just call when you feel like it.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Be well.
Goodbye.
Bye, y'all.
Campfire pale, electrical glow, both cast out shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul, and we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.